Ouagadougou, September 30, 2022. The city pulsed with tension. Roadblocks sprang up overnight like tumors. Columns of armored vehicles snaked through deserted boulevards, their engines growling under the bruised morning sky. In a makeshift command center north of the capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood motionless, a storm of decisions raging behind his still eyes. He had spent the night listening, first to the anger of his men, then to the desperate messages from loyal units across the north. Village after village had fallen to insurgents. Supply convoys ambushed. Entire regiments left to rot without reinforcements. And in the golden halls of Ouagadougou, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the very man who had promised salvation after his own coup just 9 months earlier, had grown silent, distant, indulgent. The final betrayal had come days ago. A massacre in the north. 50 soldiers dead. No backup sent. No rescue organized. Only vague condolences from the capital, and a chilling, fatalistic calm from Damiba. Something snapped then. Among the ranks, whispers turned into roars. If those who wore stars on their shoulders would not defend the nation, then new men must rise. And Ibrahim Traoré, reluctant but resolute, had become their standard. The coup began before dawn, silent and precise. Units loyal to Traoré fanned out across Ouagadougou. Key military installations, seized. National television, occupied. Strategic roads, locked down. At about 6 a.m., gunfire crackled through the air near the presidential palace. Damiba's guards hesitated, confused, leaderless. Inside the palace, Damiba, once a man of decisive action, hesitated too long. By midday it was clear. He had lost the army. Desperate, Damiba attempted negotiations. He offered reforms, concessions, even exile for Traore'S men. But the north had bled too much. Too many promises had already turned to ash. In the command center, a radio crackled. Le palais est sécurisé. Damiba a fui. Meaning, the palace is secured, Damiba has fled. Traoré exhaled, slow and heavy, as if releasing a breath he had held for years. No elections. No parliamentary debates. No crown offered. He seized power in the old way, the only way left when a government betrayed its own soldiers. By force. It was a coup, swift, surgical, inevitable. But to many in Burkina Faso, it was not just another power grab. It was vengeance. It was survival. Later that day, before the national television cameras, Traore's silhouette was etched in shadow and light. The red beret of the artillery regiment sat squarely on his head. His voice, when he spoke, carried the deep ache of a man who had seen too much death. Face à la dégradation de la situation, nous avons décidé d'assumer nos responsabilités. Meaning, faced with the deteriorating situation, we decided to take our responsibilities. He said, his French crisp, almost harsh. Les équations de Damiba ont divisé notre armée. Il a trait l'esprit de mouvement des envies. Nous ne pouvions pas rester inactifs. Meaning, Damiba's actions have divided our army. He has betrayed the spirit of the January movement. We could not remain idle. He paused, letting the silence bear the weight of truth. Nous ne combattons pas par ambition, mais pour la survie de notre nation. Meaning, we fight not for ambition, but for the survival of our nation. Across Burkina Faso, radios hummed. In dusty villages where blackened buildings marked the front lines of the war against jihadists, farmers and soldiers alike leaned closer. For the first time in months, hope, brittle and cautious, stirred. At 34 years old, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had become the youngest head of state not just in Burkina Faso, but in the entire world. Some foreign observers muttered about instability. Others spoke of yet another strongman in fatigues. But on the cracked earth of the Sahel, titles and democracy meant little when the wolves were already at the door. What mattered was this. A soldier, a real soldier, not a politician in uniform, now held the reins. And as Traoré stood beneath the heavy African sky, the red beret casting a long shadow across his face, He understood the terrible weight he had taken onto his shoulders. This was not victory. It was only the beginning. The halls of Kasyam, the sprawling presidential palace in Ouagadougou, echoed with an unfamiliar silence. Once a symbol of distant authority, it now felt hollow, a monument abandoned by ambition and claimed by necessity. Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered not as a conqueror, but as a soldier still smelling of gunpowder and the dust of the Sahel. His boots, worn and scuffed, whispered across marble floors where polished shoes once clicked in self-importance. Every step he took seemed to measure the impossible distance he had traveled, from the bloody trenches of the northern front lines to the gilded corridors of power. Outside, beyond the high walls and coiled wire, the city was waking to its new reality. Motorcycles zipped through intersections choked with burned-out debris. Vendors unpacked their goods with wary glances. And over cheap radios and cracked phone screens, one name circulated with the restless urgency of dry season winds. Captain Traoré. He had no transition team. No chorus of advisors fat with foreign degrees. Only a tight circle of loyal officers, men who had fought beside him, bled beside him. Their counsel was blunt, their loyalty fierce. But even among them, unease lingered. In the eyes of the world he was a boy playing at kingship. In the battered heart of Burkina Faso, he was a question with no easy answer. Within days of seizing power, Traoré moved to steady the crumbling ship. He dissolved the transitional government Damiba had stitched together. He promised a restoration, not to the failed politics of the past, but to something harder, purer, a government of soldiers and survivors. On October 2, 2022, standing once again before the cameras, he made it official. Clad in fatigues, his face carved with the fatigue of too many sleepless nights, Traoré declared himself president of the transition. No pomp. No parades. Just a simple statement. No sommes ici pour reconstruire. Pas pour nos miem. Mais pour ceux qui ne peuvent plus parler. Pour ceux qui gardent encore l'espoir. Meaning, we are here to rebuild. Not for ourselves. But for those who can no longer speak. For those who still hold hope. It was a fragile hope. The scars of 2 coups within a year ran deep. Cynicism like dust coated every surface. Foreign governments issued cautious statements. Paris, Washington, and Brussels muttered about monitoring the situation closely. Some saw another populist military figure, another grim page in Africa's endless book of upheavals. But in the villages still bracing against jihadist raids, Traoré's ascent sparked something dangerous and rare: faith. He was not clean-cut, not polished by international diplomacy. He was a man who had killed to protect. A man who had chosen bullets over bureaucracies when his people cried out for help. In his first weeks as head of state, Traoré refused to retreat into the velvet cages of politics. Instead, he traveled north, to Djibo, to Kaya, to Dori, to the places where soldiers fought not for headlines but for survival. Wearing the same uniform he had worn through the coup, he sat under acacia trees with village elders. He listened to mothers who spoke of sons lost to gunfire and starvation. He knelt beside the graves of comrades whose names the capital had long forgotten. And everywhere he went, he repeated the same grim promise. Plus d'abandon. Plus de trahison. No beatron. Ensemble. Meaning, no more abandonment. No more betrayal. We will fight. Together. Still, the walls of the palace grew heavy. Traoré had stepped into a battlefield far more treacherous than the deserts of the north: politics. Old warlords disguised as politicians began to circle. Foreign embassies sharpened their smiles into knives. And somewhere in the shadows, the remnants of Damiba's loyalists whispered of revenge. Captain Traoré was no fool. He understood that seizing power was merely survival. Keeping it, reshaping it into something worthy of the sacrifice, would be the real war. And so, as the dry season winds battered the palace walls and dust crept in through every crack, Ibrahim Traoré prepared for a second battle. A battle not fought with rifles, but with will, patience, and the ruthless clarity of a soldier who had seen what happened when leaders failed. The presidential chair remained empty for days after the coup, as if daring him to sit. When at last he did, it was not with triumph, but with the heavy knowledge that real leadership was not seizing the chair. It was bearing the crushing weight it demanded. And as he sat there, the twilight bleeding through the high windows, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, soldier, insurgent, reluctant president, swore to himself that he would not become what he had overthrown. The world, however, would not wait for Captain Ibrahim Traoré to catch his breath. Already, storms gathered on every horizon: jihadists in the north, politicians in the south, foreign powers whose smiles had sharpened blades. Each demanded something from him: allegiance, obedience, surrender. But Traoré had not seized the palace to bend his knee. He had come from the dust, from the places too many maps had forgotten, where boys became soldiers and soldiers became memories. He carried their ghosts now, a heavy battalion that no enemy could ever disarm. The presidential palace, with all its gilded trappings, was no fortress against what was coming. It was only the next battlefield. And Ibrahim Traoré, still wearing the same battered uniform, understood this brutal truth better than anyone. Power was not a prize. It was a burden. One that would either forge him into a legend, or destroy him before the ink on history's pages had even dried. As the last light faded over Ouagadougou and the city held its uneasy breath, Captain Traoré leaned back in the ancient chair of power. Not as a king, not as a savior, but as a soldier, bloodied, burdened, and utterly irrevocably committed. The fight for Burkina Faso's soul had only just begun.